Hello, everybody. Welcome to an online event of Tokyo College. I'm Haneda Masashi, Director of Tokyo College, and today's moderator. Many of you know that Tokyo College was established in 2019, 4 years ago. And when we discussed the design of Tokyo College before its establishment, we took the model of Collège de France into consideration. That is, providing lectures of high quality for the general public. That is exactly what we are trying to realize now. In this respect, Collège de France is a precursor and becomes a good model of Tokyo College. And there is a special agreement between Collège de France and the University of Tokyo, which allows researchers of the two institutions to visit reciprocally. Using this framework, Professor Samantha BESSON of the Collège de France kindly comes to the University of Tokyo, and now she's staying at Collège de France, Tokyo College. And she obtained habilitation in University of Bern in Switzerland and worked as a full professor of law in the University of Fribourg in Switzerland between 2005 and 19. Then she moved to Collège de France in 2019. As a professor at Collège de France, I believe she knows well how to approach to citizens and the general public. I really look forward to listening to Professor Besson's lecture. The title of her lecture today is Science, a Human Right. And for discussion today, Professor Sayaka of the Graduate School of Education kindly accepted to be a discussant. She's a historian of science and technology. Her main research interests concern the intellectual history of academic freedom and the socio-economic history of academic institutions of science in Europe. So I believe she is an ideal discussant for Professor Besson's lecture. So let's listen to Professor Besson. Please start your lecture.
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here today in person, but mostly online because we're here on our own in this room. I'm extremely honored by this invitation to lecture at Tokyo College today, and I'm extremely grateful to Professor Haneda and Tokyo College for inviting me, and to Professor Hoki, whom I've met on this occasion, for agreeing to provide comments on this lecture. So a few words by way of introduction. I selected the topic for tonight's lecture because it is one of the questions I'm currently working on. At the Collège de France, we always teach our research in progress, what Ernest Renan used to refer to as the savoir en voie de se faire. And this lecture abroad is no exception to the rule. I will be teaching today what I'm researching. So the human right to science, as it is often called, and I will come back to this denomination later on because it is at the heart of the problem. The human right to science is at the core of a 4-year research project of the Swiss National Science Foundation, which I've been leading since 2022. In short, this project pertains to what Robert Merton's famous article published in 1942 referred to as the normative structure of science, but by extension, what the research project is interested in is the legal and institutional framework of science in general, the legal framework that guarantees the autonomy of science in the strict sense, i.e. its capacity for self-regulation, while also organizing and constraining science at the same time. Now, the establishment of such a legal and institutional framework for science, one that is able to guarantee scientific freedom, of course, it also guarantees non-discriminatory access to the benefits of science and protection against the harmful effects of certain scientific uses, is one of the duties that can be grounded in the human right to science. And this positive duty of the state to institute and organize science at law also applies at the international level where such a legal and institutional framework is unfortunately still missing. Now, the lack of such an international legal and institutional framework is problematic because science has become a universal practice that goes well beyond national borders. And it has been this way for a long time. I'm quoting here Louis Pasteur, who famously said what you can read now on the screen. He said in 1888, science has no homeland because knowledge is the heritage of humanity. Now, if science has no homeland, it can no longer be guaranteed and organized only within the framework of each state's legal and institutional order. As a matter of fact, the lack of such an international framework for science has had at least two negative consequences. First, the lack of an international framework gives free rein to the most powerful states, the most powerful scientifically, but also economically and militarily, since the three of them usually go hand in hand. So the lack of an international framework has given a free rein to the most powerful states to impose their own legal framework on the universal practice of science outside their borders, or at least to trigger a legal competition between the national legal regimes of science, thereby leading to a regulatory race to the bottom and to a form of scientific forum shopping. And I'm thinking here of the Western scientific property model that has disseminated throughout the world and nowadays even applies to the means of protection of indigenous knowledge or to the monetization of open access today. A second implication or consequence, negative consequence of the absence of a public international legal and institutional framework for science is that it leaves the private sector unchecked, which is problematic in an era of intense transnational privatization of scientific research. And a few examples suffice here to capture the problem. One that we've just experienced, the limited access to the privately researched and owned latest RNA vaccines, or the lack of oversight of the private development of new technologies, such as genome editing, climate geoengineering, spatial exploration, or the latest AI application. Now, curiously, and despite the need for institutionalization in this area, which I've just exemplified, the duty to provide an international legal and institutional framework for science is the dimension of the content of the human right to science that has not yet been sufficiently interpreted by legal scholars, let alone implemented. In fact, more generally, the content of the human right to science remains largely unexploited today, both in practice and in theory. It is the object of tonight's lecture to explore the reasons for this and maybe contribute to change the situation. Now, besides the practical urgency of the topic, I've chosen the issue of the human right to science for this lecture among different research projects I could have exposed today, primarily for two reasons. First, it's probably the topic that interests most of us here. Science is what brings us together in universities all around the world, in Paris, in Tokyo. And human rights, it's like football, everyone has an opinion. The second reason I chose this topic is because, and this has been confirmed since then, and we'll see this in this discussion later on, I think it's a topic on which I could learn lots from an interdisciplinary discussion like the one I will have with Professor Oki, but also a topic on which I could learn from the Japanese and more broadly Asian conceptions of science and your approach to the importance of the legal and institutional framework of science. So one question on the agenda for tonight, is science a human right? Or more precisely, is there a human right to science? Now, as often, the question is as interesting as the answer. And you've probably thought of many ways of understanding this question before logging in tonight. I will only mention 4 of them here, and those 4 ways of understanding the question will structure my argument. They will constitute the thread of my lecture. There will be 4 sections in the lecture, And the first section, which tries to respond to the first question, is the following. Is the human right to science actually guaranteed as a human right in international human rights law? This is the easy and I think very primary way of understanding the question I've raised for tonight. Is there such a thing as a human right to science in international human rights law? And the answer is as simple as the question, yes, there is a human right to science in international human rights law, and it's been the case since 1948. You can see now on the screen Article 27. Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose first paragraph actually protects and has protected since 1948 the right to science as a right to share in scientific advancements and its benefits. Now, this guarantee has since been confirmed in a compulsory way in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in Article 15(1)(b) of that provision, which guarantees, as you can see, the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. If you read that provision carefully, you'll see that there is also a third paragraph in the provision that protects academic freedom or freedom of research or scientific research more specifically. In fact, there is even a second provision in Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is the twin covenant, which protects the right to freedom of research a second time in a sense, okay? So freedom of research, academic freedom is guaranteed in 19.2, but also in 15.3. What I will not discuss tonight are the regional guarantees of the human right to science. There have been regional guarantees before and after 1948. The Inter-American human rights system was a pioneer in this context. In Europe, things have been slower to develop. In fact, in Europe, we have no trace of the human right to science in the European Convention on Human Rights, but we have an Article 13 in the European Union's Charter of Fundamental Rights, but that provision only protects scientific research and not the right to science in general. Nor will I deal tonight with domestic constitutional or public law guarantees of the human rights to science. Those were either revised or adopted after 1948, and they mostly focus on the freedom of research or academic freedom and not on the right to science in general. Article 5.3 of the German Constitution is, of course, extremely famous here. You have it here in the text, in the original, in German. And as you know, you've got a guarantee in the Japanese Constitution in Article 23 of academic freedom. But I will not address those tonight, but so that you all know there's also law in domestic instruments and regional ones. So Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the fruit of a very Mertonian, I refer to Robert Merton here again, consensus that emerged in the 1940s, so pre-war, according to which science was to be conceived as a public institution, one that had to be legally established and guaranteed by the state, and whose legal and institutional framework had to be organized. And what the Second World War confirmed was the need to go further than a mere legal and institutional guarantee of science. What it confirmed was the need to make that legal and institutional framework international and no longer only national, and also the need to turn it into a full-fledged human right. So the war really was a step up in the legal institutional framework of science by making it international first and making it a human right secondly. The post-war consensus in this respect grew out of two realizations. On the one hand, the awareness of the potential contrast and conflict actually between scientific progress and moral and social progress. Both of them didn't always go hand in hand. And the second realization of the war was the awareness of the potential harmful effects of science, triggered, as we know, by the you'll-use debate. In 1948, the fundamental protection of the public good science in the form of an international human right therefore reflected a double recognition. And this has been confirmed many times since, and I've referred to this as a dualistic dimension or nature of the human rights to science. What the protection of the human right to science in 1948 confirmed as a recognition was first the recognition that there is a fundamental equal interest of the human person to participate, access to, and benefit from science. And the second recognition or realization was the recognition that this human person should also be able to be protected against the harmful effects of science when the latter does not promote her fundamental equality, but actually puts that equality in danger. And this dualistic dimension of the right is something that's been confirmed many times since in various UN bodies' interpretations of the right. For instance, the Committee on Economic and Social Rights has confirmed as early as 2009 in the guidelines you now have on the screen that when states report to the committee what they've done in relation to the protection of the human right to science, they should do two things: indicate the measures they've taken to protect and ensure access to the benefits of scientific progress, but also, secondly, the measures they've taken to prevent the use of scientific progress for purposes which are contrary to the enjoyment of human dignity and human rights. And this dualistic dimension of the right, which we've had since 1948, was confirmed most recently in the general comment, so it's a general interpretation that's been provided by the Committee on Economic, Social and Economic Rights in 2020, where the committee stressed what you have on the screen, is that the development of science in the service of peace and human rights should be prioritized because it doesn't necessarily go this way. And another quote from the general comment says the same with regard to new technologies. It says states have to adopt policies that expand the benefits while at the same time reducing their risks. Now, in terms of content, the human right to science is currently interpreted as having three dimensions, and it's interpreted as corresponding to three rights and/or freedoms. And this has also been repeated by various UN bodies, including by UNESCO in the Venice Statement of 2009, which you now have on the screen. Those three dimensions or three rights that are encapsulated in the human right to science are a right to participate in scientific progress, and that includes freedom of research. Secondly, a right to benefit from science and to have access to its benefits. And finally, and thirdly, a right to be protected from the harmful effects of certain scientific practices. Okay, so this is quite important, and we'll get back to this in the course of the lecture. So this was a crash course as quickly as possible into the legal status of the guarantee of the human right to science under international human rights law between 1948 and today. But you probably asking yourself, if the human right to science is guaranteed in international law, and if the first question I raised for us tonight actually receives a positive answer, then why haven't we heard more of and about that right? And this brings me to the second way of understanding tonight's question, which is the following. Is the human right to science respected in the practice of international human rights law? Maybe the reason we haven't heard of it is because it's not being respected, it's not practiced by states, and as a result, no one cares because no one's ever heard of it. Now, it indeed appears at first sight that the human right to science is not or hardly put into practice by states. By states, I mean the 171 state parties to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and Japan, France, and Switzerland are all members, parties to that covenant. This is what we can get a confirmation for if one reads the periodic reports of states that they have to periodically submit to the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And that's also what's confirmed from the very few, in fact, there's only been one so far, individual complaints that have been filed with the committee concerning the human right to science. There was one complaint in 2017 that was addressed in 2019, but that's it. No wonder then, in light of this very little amount of practice, that the human right to science has been referred to by Aibe Riedel as the sleeping beauty of international human rights law. Now, what's at stake here is the classic question in legal theory of the relationship between the lack of respect and hence of effectiveness of a right on the one hand, and its existence or validity as a right on the other. Indeed, in legal philosophy, it's quite common to consider that when the lack of practice of a legal norm reaches a certain degree, then one may doubt at its authority and perhaps even at its legal validity. And this is a vast debate. But very fortunately for me and for you, we don't need to enter into that very difficult debate here. Indeed, the lack of practice of the human right to science by states that I've just described for you is actually only apparent. And it's only apparent for three reasons. First of all, the lack of practice of the human right to science affects, above all, our states, those of the North and the West, and more generally, those of the developed scientific world, including, obviously, Japan. This is important, of course, because these are the scientific powers of the day, so far at least, the ones that have propagated the now prevalent conception of science around the world, and the ones from which many of the transnational private actors, the ones I discussed in my introduction, the private actors of global science, actually stem. In short, then, there is practice of the human right to science, including practice summarized in the periodic reports of states and consolidating in the concluding observation of the Committee on Economic and Social Rights. But that practice is not very visible to us for political reasons. It does not emanate from the states that run the politics of global science. Second reason for why the lack of practice is only apparent. The existing state practice before the Committee on Economic, Social Rights, Social and Cultural Rights, confirms that the human right to science has indeed been implemented, but mostly with respect to two dimensions. Freedom of research, and that's not a surprise because, as I told you before, this is the dimension of the human right to science on which there is precisely more national law and more national practice in general. And the second dimension on which there's been practice reported to the committee, it's the equal access to scientific applications. No wonder then that the practice of the human right to science has usually been mixed with that of other human rights from other treaties or from the same treaty, such as freedom of research or the human right to health. In short then, there is practice, including practice summarized in the periodic reports of states and consolidated in the concluding observations of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But the practice of the human right to science is not very visible to us for political reasons. It does not emanate from the states that runs the politics of global science, as I said before, but it overlaps with practice that takes place outside the scope of the human right to science and is therefore less visible. Finally, if the human rights to science takes the back seat in states' practice under the Committee of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, it's because of the reformulation of the human right to science that took place in 1966 at the height of the Cold War. The reason there is so little visible practice of the human right to science, therefore, and this is the most important reason, is that the most important and the most specific dimension of the human right to science, what I will refer to as the participatory dimension of the right to science, was muted back then. And it suffices here to compare the two formulations of the right. On the left-hand side, you have the formulation of 1948, and on the right-hand side of the screen, you get the formulation of Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So 48 versus 1966. And if you check the wording, you will see that the human right to science, like all other social rights, in fact, at that time, was stripped of its social and active dimension to become a purely individual and passive right. The sharing in, the participation was lost and was replaced or reduced uniquely to the enjoyment of benefits. Like other social and cultural rights, the human right to science became a mere right to be, or to receive, in this case, to receive benefits, rather than a right to do, to participate with others. And at the same time, and confirming the individualizing trend of Article 15, freedom of research emerged. Freedom of research received a second and specific mention in Article 15.3, and a third guarantee, as I mentioned before, in Article 19.2 of the Second Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So the right to science became more individualized, lost its participatory dimension, and academic freedom, scientific freedom, received a double express guarantee in two different provisions. As a matter of fact, this debate and this tension around active participation in science versus passive enjoyment of benefits took place during the travaux préparatoires for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Back then, you could see one of the groups defending the version that finally won in 1966, defending the Rooseveltian position, which you now have here on the screen. You can see the Four Freedoms speech of Roosevelt, where you can find this notion of enjoyment of fruits. Except that in 1948, and the travaux préparatoires and the discussion, that position didn't win, and the version was adopted actually entailed a two-tier guarantee: sharing or participate in scientific advancements and enjoy its benefits. Was in 1966, as I said, the participatory dimension got lost. One may therefore consider that the human right to science did not simply fall asleep, as it is often said, and as I referred to before when I referred to the sleeping beauty of international human rights. It was actually sent to bed. It was intentionally put to sleep. In sum, and in response to the second way of understanding the question posed in tonight's lecture, one should note that there is some state practice of the human right to science, but that it is insufficient in the part of the world that leads the way in scientific matters, and that this actually affects international law in the area. Moreover, the existing state practice deals with dimensions of the scientific practice that are already protected by other human rights, thereby losing its specificity and making the right less visible and less attractive in practice. Finally and precisely, what made the human right to science specific, its participatory dimension, was intentionally taken out of the text of the Human Right to Science Guarantee in 1966, and therefore of its practice. Now, given all this, it's not at all surprising that so few of you have ever heard of the human right to science. Now, very interestingly for us tonight, there's been a renewed interest in the human right to science lately, and a desire to bring it out of its deep sleep and slumber, and in particular to revive its original participatory dimension. This is true both in academic circles, but also at the UN. Various declarations, recommendations, observations, reports have been published since about 15 years ago. UNESCO published a lot. The Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights published a lot. And of course, the Committee on Economic Social Rights, which published in 2020 its General Comment 25, which I've mentioned before. And as evidence of this revival of the participatory dimension of science, I will just mention this quote from the general comment that was published in 2022. As you can see from the general comment, paragraph 11, the committee actually renames the right. It says, the right enshrined in Article 15(1)b is the right to participate in and to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its application. Now, this renewed interest in the participatory dimension of the human right to science can be explained by a return to circumstances quite similar to those that led to the 1940s consensus on the public institution of science and to the guarantee of the human right to science in 1948, albeit with new particularities, of course. And to refer to Merton, again, the history of the relationship between science and law, science and politics, may be interestingly approached, I think, as a history of pendulum swings, oscillating between the private or public instrumentalization of science on the one hand, and the self-validation of scientists in the form of a defense against that instrumentalization on the other. And these two ends of the pendulum swing are observable again today, it seems to me. Again, we've come full circle to the re-emergence of science, to quote Merton, albeit this time in a postmodern world. To start with, there has been lately a return of the private instrumentalization of science. Science has been instrumentalized to the market, this time through its individualization and commodification in a global economy that is driven by research for innovation and is driven by research and technology. In reaction to this renewed instrumentalization of science to the market, we've noticed an opposite discourse that has emerged recently. This new discourse is marked by the reference to the public good of science in reaction to the privatization of science. It's been marked by renewed references to participatory science in reaction to the individualization of science. And it's been marked by calls for open science in reaction to the commodification of science. And finally, and following those two swings towards privatization of science and a counter attempt to regain control of science by public law and politics, one may also observe a renewed and strengthened counter-reaction of self-validation of scientists. And what makes the situation even more concerning this time around is the recent development of high-risk and high uncertainty technological research with a long-term impact. In these conditions, the urgency to protect not only the beneficial effects of science, but also against its potentially negative effects is even more present today than it was in 1948, with all the difficult questions of anticipation of risks and benefits this raises. Now, there are various ways of seizing what I have referred to as the new institutional moment for science, an international institutional moment for science this time. One may concern ourselves first with ways to gain political momentum for the international institutionalization of science. And this political momentum will not be easy to gain. In a world dominated by a certain conception of science, individualized, instrumentalized, privatized, it won't be easy in a world and a global economy that is based on applied research, technology, and innovation. And it won't be easy in a world that is certainly more inclusive than it was in 1948, but far more inegalitarian than it was then, and therefore more divided on all matters relative to the public institution of science. However, parallel to the work of political conviction, which is urgent, it's essential, I think, to begin with a conceptual and normative reflection on what regaining the participatory dimension of the human right to science could mean. In other words, before going to politics, I think we need to clarify what we mean by the participatory dimension of science. Indeed, approaching the public good of science as a participatory good has important implications, first for the content of the human right to science, but also second for its right holders and duty bearers, and in particular for the collective nature. And referring to the collective nature of a human right is extremely controversial in human rights law and theory. And it's a difficulty that should not be underestimated when preparing to revive the human right to science in practice. Such a reflection on the human right, in the human rights theory of the human rights to science, is all the more important as there is still a fundamental inconsistency within the General Comment 25 between this new emphasis on the participatory approach to the human right to science, which is to be commended for, and other elements of the right that still reflect to the dominant, Popperian, one may say, approach to science, a dominant approach to science that has been endorsed by UNESCO, by states within UNESCO, definition of science, and that's been included in the General Comment 25, as you can see here on the screen. So there's a strong contradiction between, on the one hand, promoted this understanding of science that you have on the screen, which actually creates huge problem when you try to accommodate indigenous knowledge or non-Western and not Northern science within the scope of the human right to science. So pushing for this kind of understanding, Popperian understanding of science, on the one hand, and at the same time wanting to endorse a participatory dimension of science. In fact, the problem, I think, starts with the denomination of the human right to science itself. I've been using this term ever since the beginning of the lecture, but the term is problematic. The term is incompatible with the participatory dimension of science. And this will be my third point and question, which pertains to the interest protected by this right so that it can be considered a human right. Can they actually be, from a conceptual and normative perspective, a human right to science, as there is a human right to life or a human right to water? The answer is no. And this is due to the object and therefore to the interest protected by the human right to science. Science is a public good and actually a participatory public good. And therefore it is a good whose value lies precisely in participation. As a result, the only right to this kind of participatory good there can be is a participatory right. That is a right to participate in science as a participatory practice, as opposed to a right to science as an end product of that practice. Think about it. We've had the same debates for years about the right to democracy, the human right to democracy, which cannot be a human right to democracy as an end product. It is a human right to participate in a democratic practice. And the same applies to the human right to culture, which is best understood as a human right to participate in cultural life. So let me explain. To start with, public goods or collective goods are goods whose inherent value resides in the collective or social dimension and in the fact that they are goods for all. This is the case of science, that is and actually should be valuable to all of us together as a group, and not only as a sum of individual goods. The contrast with the right to life is useful here. Life is primarily a good whose value is primarily individual, which explains why there can be a right to life in itself. Of course, you'll tell me not all public goods are participatory, but science, and that is its second characteristic, is a participatory public good, like other cultural goods, whose value lies in participation in the good. And here I will only quote Denise Réaume, whose quote I think explains very well how we could understand the participatory dimension of cultural goods, including science. The value of science for all of us lies in the collective acquisition and consolidation of our knowledge, whether in distinct epistemic communities or in the epistemic community of epistemic community, i.e. the community of public law, that is the state. And in fact, science has a third particularity. It's a public good that is not only participatory, but is also a common or communal good. Indeed, participating in science is not only in the interest of all members of an epistemic community, it's also a responsibility of each member of the community. This is what communis, communus means, being in the charge, in the responsibility of the community. It's in the sense that we can understand the different scientific responsibilities that constitute the scientific ethos and what we now call scientific integrity in scientific ethics. So to claim that just like the protected good of science, the human right to science is participatory, is to say that it is participatory in all its dimensions, in the 3 dimensions that I referred to earlier in the lecture. It's participatory in scientific freedom. We don't exercise and value our scientific freedom on our own or only derivatively. We exercise it and value it together. But it also applies to the right to benefit from science and have access to its benefits. And finally, to the right to be protected from the harmful effects of certain scientific practices. It would be incorrect, therefore, to oppose scientific process to its outcome and to claim that the former, scientific practice, progress, is participatory, whereas the latter, knowledge, benefits, is not. And here I quote Denise Rhéaume again, "There is no end product, as science is in constant reproduction." Secondly, it would be incorrect to oppose scientists to other participants and to claim that the rights of scientists are participatory, whereas the rights of all others would be non-participatory. And this has also been confirmed by General Comment 25, which opposes a rigid distinction between the rights of scientists and the rights of non-scientists. It's not possible to benefit from a participatory good without participating in it. Of course, an individual contribution or an individual enjoyment is always possible, but it only takes place at the margins of the practice. It is diffuse, parasitic in a sense, and depends on participation in a collective scientific practice, both in terms of scientific contribution and enjoyments of the benefits. A bit like listening to music or reading a novel that is only valuable if you can practice and participate in it with others. Importantly, however, this does not mean that everyone can participate in scientific research in the same way. Different forms of participation in the same scientific enterprise are possible, provided they're all participatory. So there's no human right for all to become scientists. Secondly, participation applies to different dimensions of the scientific practice, research itself, of course, but also the organization of science. So there are many ways of doing citizen science. There are 3 normative consequences of this participatory interpretation of the human right to science for the legal and institutional framework of science, both at the national and the international level. Those 3 consequences derive from the 3 dimensions of the public good of science. It's public, as I said before, it's participatory, and it's common. So the first consequence is that we need to be able to go from the public good of science to the democratic institution of science. And this democratic dimension of the human right to science goes well beyond the right of everyone to participate democratically in the identification and specification of his or her human rights. It goes further because the human right to science also includes the right to participate democratically in the institutional and legal organization of the public practice of science as such. And this is what the General Comment 25 refers to as the need for participatory national framework law. Second consequence of this time from the participatory good of science, there should be a public law of science. If science is a participatory good, the public and legal and institutional organization of the collective practice is key to the protection of the good. And this has been confirmed by the General Comment 25 as well, which refers to the need for a normative framework of science. Now, this notion of a public law of science echoes the 17th century idea of a republic of sciences, la République des sciences. It reflects the importance of constituting a public ternary guarantee and organization of science as a social institution distinct from the state, and which allows science to be protected both from the state and from the market, but also from itself and from the self-validation of science by science. This right to a public, legal and institutional framework of science does not stop at the constitutional level. It also implies the development of a social scientific law that can frame the self-regulation of science, just as social labor law frames collective agreements and the self-regulation of work by workers and employers. For all the reasons mentioned in my introduction, the public law of science should also be international. Third implication, this time from the common good of science. The common dimension of the good of science has actually implications for the good scientific self-government of science. Because science is a good that is not only in everyone's interest, but also in everyone's responsibility, the human right to science protects a right to self-government and self-regulation of scientists. As it protects a common good that is the responsibility of all, however, it imposes limits on that self-regulation. It imposes egalitarian and democratic limits that guarantee and protect the autonomy of science. Hence, my idea of a good self-governance of science. Importantly, this right to scientific democracy does not mean confusing science with politics or treating science as any other area of public life. What is at stake is a democracy specific to science, just as there is a social democracy specific to the organization of trade union and labor relations, for instance. So, the participatory and hence collective dimension of the public good of science, that is the object of the human right to science, as I've just argued for, does not only have implications for the content of the right, as I've just sketched, it also has implications for the collective identity of the right holders and or duty bearers of the right. Now, this is a very controversial question in international human rights law, and one that needs to be addressed specifically. And this gives rise to the fourth and last way to understand this lecture's question: is the human right to science a human right? A fourth way of approaching the question of tonight's lecture concerns the implications of the participatory and hence collective nature of the good and interest protected by the human right to science, and by extension of the right itself, this time for the collective as opposed to the individual nature of its right holders and duty bearers. Can there be, conceptually and normatively, a human right to science? Is it owed by other human beings in an inter-individual way? Now, in the field of international human rights law that is dominated by a certain form of individualism, the reference to the term collective is often a source of concern, and usually even of confusion, actually, because it can refer to an interest or right of a group, as well as to the interest or right of an individual to be exercised collectively. In this lecture, to clarify things, I will use the term group rights to refer to the first type of collective interests, and I will refer to the term collective rights to refer to individual interests and rights that are held jointly and exercised collectively. In what follows, I will distinguish first between the collective and individual rights related to science, and second, between the individual and collective duties generated by these rights. So let me start with the collective dimensions of scientific rights. There are, I would like to argue, both collective and individual scientific rights. Scientific rights are best interpreted as being primarily collective rights, i.e. rights to be exercised jointly or even as a group, and then only in a second tier, individual rights that derive from the collective ones. So in what follows, I will present three categories of scientific rights. First, the core collective rights, which are the main rights of the human right to science. Second, the derived individual rights. And third, an additional group rights that may be recognized in certain cases. So first, the core collective rights, the core scientific rights that need to be exercised jointly. These are the main rights of the human right to science. To the extent that the public good of science is participatory, and you may remember that this has been confirmed by the General Comment 25, the human right to science is participatory in all its dimensions, and hence collective in all those dimensions as well. Those collective rights may be rights of scientists as well as other members of the public, and there may be freedoms as well as claim rights. Then, of course, in the second tier, come derivative individual rights to enjoy science and its benefits alone and without others, as it is the case with other cultural rights. However, as I explained before, those individual rights are only derivative and parasitic to the core collective rights to participate in both the scientific practice and the enjoyments of its benefits. And then only in a third tier can we add a third category of scientific rights, which amount to additional group rights. The most common example here is that of the human rights of indigenous peoples, but also the rights of other epistemic communities that one may consider as collective holders of the human right to science. The question of so-called indigenous or traditional knowledge is interesting because its current treatment reveals how much the dominant and Popperian conception of science, qua individual, universal, and hence acultural, and eternal, and hence ahistorical knowledge is still prevalent in the current interpretation of the human right to science. And as I mentioned before, it's very prevalent in the general comment 25 because it's actually there in the middle of the comment. Now, this understanding of science, which was not necessary, and we can come back to this in the conversation later, makes it difficult to seize and especially protect indigenous knowledge as a form of scientific knowledge. At the moment, indeed, if you read general comment, you will notice that indigenous knowledge is addressed as the object of cultural rights only. When indigenous knowledge rights are associated with collective rights, it's at most as the rights of indigenous peoples that derive not from the human right to science, but from the right to self-determinations of those peoples. And finally, when the general comment envisages individual rights to indigenous knowledge, it's primarily as a question of intellectual property rights, and hence as a question of ownership. In fact, approaching indigenous knowledge from a human rights perspective would not only be beneficial to indigenous knowledge, but it would also be beneficial to scientific diversity in general, and to the recognition of the diversity of science in the plural, which is one of the aims of the general comment. As I have argued in this lecture, science is just as collective and just as participatory as indigenous epistemic practices. It amounts as much to a process as to an outcome, and participating in the process amounts to the good of science. Secondly, all science stems from a cultural context, originally European, later turned universal through scientific colonialism, and hence stems from a culture rather than from a pre-existing universal truth. And finally, science is also transmitted from generation to generation, and thus part of an historically situated tradition rather than the result of an eternal abstraction. So you see, there is a lot to gain from approaching the human right to science also as a group right, and this is something that is not sufficiently done at the moment in general comment 25. So I had planned in this final section of the lecture to go over the collective dimension of human rights duties. I won't be able to go into the detail here for reasons of time, but let me say the following, because this could be of interest to some of you. Under international human rights law, human rights duties, and that's true also for the duties under the human right to science, are duties of states and public institutions. They are not individual duties. But what's really problematic for the human right to science is that, like for other human rights duties are usually held by states individually to people under their jurisdiction. And what I would like to argue, and what I argue elsewhere, and I can't do here fully now, is that because the human right to science actually protects a public good and a universal public good, a public good that is threatened universally by universal threats, then we can make the argument that states not only owe individual duties under that right to people under their jurisdiction, but we can actually make the argument that states owe those duties together, collectively, and actually should cooperate towards protecting the human right to science And this has been stressed in the general comment 25, of course, but not sufficiently well at the moment, I think, and not specified sufficiently. And an example, I think, which is sufficient to exemplify this argument is the scientific development of vaccines. The protection of the development of vaccines amounts to the protection of a universal public good, and protecting that universal public good against universal threats actually requires the cooperation of states rather than each state individually owing the human right to science to people under its jurisdiction. Having reached the end of this lecture, it's time for me to conclude. To revert to the 4 questions I've raised with you tonight, and which you now have on the screen, and starting with the first one, science has been the object of a human right since 1948. But if this right still lacks international practice, or at least a visible one, that was my second question, it's notably because it lost its participatory dimension in 1966, a dimension that is now being rehabilitated in practice. I've outlined in my lecture, and that was my third point, where the participatory dimension of the public good of science should imply exactly for the participatory nature of the object and content of the right, and fourthly, for the collective identity of its right holders, but also of its duty bearers that should cooperate to protect the right to science. We are confronted today with circumstances concerning the relationship between science and politics or law that are reminiscent of those that prompted the pre-war consensus, that prompted Merton's concerns. We are confronted with circumstances that are reminiscent of the original recognition of the human right to science in 1948, and in particular with a growing public and private instrumentalization of science and a defensive reaction of self-validation by scientists. However, unlike our predecessors, we are lucky enough to have inherited a human right to participate in and benefit from science in international human rights law, a human right that it would be hard to adopt and guarantee anew today. But a human right, even if it was put asleep in 1966, that is a given, that is there, that is available in international human rights law, and that only needs to be grasped, interpreted, and applied. Wars are usually good times to rethink the relations between law and science. Will we be able to seize internationally what I refer to as the new institutional moment for science? Let us hope so. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Professor BESSON, for your very clear, logic, and thought-provoking lecture. But at the same time, it is something very legal discussion, I think. And maybe Professor Sayaka will give some additional discussion from her perspective as a historian of science. Before asking Professor Oki, I would like to draw your attention once again, dear audience, to ask questions and comments, make comments by pushing a Q&A button on your screen below. You can write your comments and questions both in English and in Japanese. If we have some free time available, I will pick up some of them and ask questions to both speaker and commentator. So now I would like to ask Professor Sayaka to make some comments and questions to Professor BESSON's lecture.
Well, dear colleagues, many thanks for your excellent lecture. I'll just let me share my screen now, and then I will start. So, as today's audience, I was really impressed by your talk, which has provided us with a very important perspective to consider a better future society, especially to deal more effectively with the series of crises such as pandemic, wars, and so on, which we are unfortunately facing now. Well, but first of all, as a historian, I would like to say that I find a great satisfaction to discover that the recent arguments on the human right to science resonate with the echoes of the 17th century concept of a republic of science or republic of letters, with which I'm familiar with. So it is my hope that this notion allows science to be protected both from the undue influence and problematic influence by both the state and the market, but also shield it from potential internal biases from the scientists. Moreover, it should foster a more inclusive and a responsible relationship between science and society at large. And your talk made me remember, sorry, so this slide is about something different. Your talk made me remember a passage from Condorcet's work, Fragment sur l'Atlantide, Fragment on the New Atlantis in English, which epitomizes the utopian vision of the Republic of Sciences. In this work, Condorcet tries to establish a connection between democracy and science, conceptualizing them as participatory endeavors, with some details a little bit different from yours. But his contemplation envisions a future wherein the perfection of human mind and morals resulted in a democratic world civilization without class distinction or inequalities of wealth distribution. So in this ideal society, citizens would voluntarily unite to participate in science, well, mainly by voting for choosing scientists, savant in French. And citizens so would so the chosen scientists were expected to develop research agendas for the progress of science. Well, this is just the vision of the 18th century. It's just for anecdotes. The old dream had been lost from memory for a long time, particularly since the end of the Cold War, because the term like progress, especially in philosophy, we abandon it a little bit, if I can say that. But international society has had, so at that time, I mean, since the end of the Cold War, international society has had excessive optimism regarding the capacity of a unified capitalist market. However, this optimism ended up with the emergence of profound social and environmental crises, as we are presently aware. Regarding the social crisis, we observe, so as I show it in slide, we observe growing inequality among the rich and poor in society and the rise of authoritarian regimes, especially in this left side of the slide. It's all over the world, so there's a little bit problematic tendency. According to recent studies conducted by the Variety of Democracy Institute, this development has been empirically linked to a declining trend of academic freedom in many countries. Well, I cannot explain the details of that image, which was taken from the website of VDEM Institute. As you see in the bottom right, you see the countries where the academic freedom declined. So, and Japan is here. So you can see in the middle of not that bad, but not so good. Anyway, from 2012 to 2022, academic freedom declined also in Japan and in many countries. Well, so as was mentioned in your talk, academic freedom is one of the essential elements to realizing the human rights to science, if I understand well. Therefore, the present situation is really pressing. So it seems to be the time to move. And I would like to say something I'm not sure. Well, just an additional things. You mentioned the Japanese constitution, but Japan follows that trend. And as to the constitution of Japan, you are right to say that it guarantees academic freedom. However, we observe a move weakening that effect of Article 23 in my country of our constitution. In fact, some legal experts began to say that it covers only the freedom of individual research, not the autonomy of scientific institutions like universities and academies. So unfortunately, we discovered such a lack of consensus even among law experts. So I just would like to mention it as a part of this global phenomena. Well, I think a series of endeavors have already been undertaken in different sectors to react to that difficulty. For example, certain philosophers advocate the new enlightenment and talks about the establishment of global solidarity to recouple economic prosperity and humanistic goals, including democracy, well-being, good life, and so on. And international organization, including UNESCO, UN, and ISC, it is International Science Council, have initiated dialogues addressing the right to science. These organizations express these concerns regarding the current situations faced by scientists all over the world, such as inequality for accessing scientific knowledge between rich and poor countries. So in developed countries, even scientists have difficulty to access journals, for example, even to publish an article in especially open publishing journal. It needs really a huge cost. So the access to research and access to knowledge is not well guaranteed in developed countries. And there are also growing tendency of bureaucratic or nationalistic governance over the science. Through university reforms, researchers, for example, many researchers feel more and more restrictions on their research practices. So, so anyway, there's a huge kind of pressure felt by researchers in many fields. And there are also problematic relationships between the media and citizens, with media and citizens. So anyway, there are many elements which have, which disseminate a growing, feeling of crises. And there's also a problem between, there's also the problem of interface between public and private sciences. As was mentioned, there are many important researches done in private sectors, but from the society, the research in that sector is not so visible. So we are not sure about the integrity of the research in that sector. Well, so it is just a report of the current situation from my perspective. Now I move to some questions. There are 3 questions in my mind. First question is about the definition of science. So how is science defined in the discussion among legal experts? Well, you mentioned the difficulty to define it, but I would like to know more about it. If possible, so could you tell me especially more to elucidate the status of humanities and social sciences in the discussion of human rights to science? So it is first question. And second question is, I would like to know more about the difference between the right to politics, especially democracy, and the right to science. You explain something like you explained that they are really similar in the sense that it referred to the participation, but if there are some differences, I would like to know. My third question is about well, it is a little bit difficult question. I would like to know if the human right to science can be applied also to the military research sector, or should that sector be treated as different from the civil or both private and public research sector? So if there's any difference in the treatment of these sectors. So I stop now because I'm afraid that we don't have enough time, much time to talk about all different things, and we have also questions from the audiences. So just please.
So maybe question 4 will be later.
Yes, yeah, I put it later. So if we have time. So.
So your response, Samantha?
Great. Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor O'Keefe, for those very, very generous comments. And of course, the audience can't see, the full extent of the comments I've received. So I'm extremely grateful. Thank you so much. And it's also a fantastic way of meeting. So I'm very grateful. I'm really pleased you referred to Condorcet and the fragments sur l'Atlantide. And it actually comes back in one of your questions later. I suppose I would like to make 2 comments in respect to that fragment and this discussion in Condorcet. The first one, and I think this is maybe important for the audience, is the kind of argument I've been defending or putting forward today is non-ideal. So it's very different from the Condorcet ideal argument. It starts with the law and what we have in the law in terms of the human right to science. And it tries to interpret that right in the best way, in a way to provide the best justification of the right. So it's a very different way of approaching the problem, but I'm extremely pleased if the proposals and the arguments actually meet. The second thing I want to say about Condorcet and what you showed, which was very interesting, is that, as you said as well, we've moved away a lot from those proposals. But they're still in the air. If you look at the work by people like Heather Douglas, Philip Kitcher, Zeynep Pamuk, the relationship between science and democracy, and how much democracy should there be in science, and how much science should there be in democracy, and should the democracy in science be the exact symmetry of democracy in politics? All those questions are still very much with us. They get a different answer, obviously, but they're very much with us. And I would like to give an example here is the kind of democracy one would expect from the International Panel on Climate Change. We know science is there. We know the International Panel on Climate Change actually produces recommendations and discussions that are key for the future of international law on climate change. But how democratic are they? Do they need to be representative? Representative in what sense? Do they need to represent other scientists? Do they need to represent the public? How do they interact with other representatives of the public? I mean, those questions are extremely timely, and they're very much the same raised by Condorcet. So I'm really glad you raised this, and I just wanted as a tribute to complement the discussion. Now, getting to your 3 questions, we can discuss Japan and comparison later because this is really fascinating, but there's no time now, I think. Moving to your first question, I think this is spot on. It's a very important question. My understanding of General Comment 25 and the current interpretation of the human right to science by the UN is that they want to be as open as possible about the kind of sciences it covers. And it definitely covers both hard or natural, whatever we want to call them, sciences, and social and human sciences. The problem they get into is due to the UNESCO definition. And by bringing in that UNESCO definition, that is UNESCO states definition, which is very Popperian, as I said before, very individual, very cultural, very ahistorical, then they create problems for themselves because that definition doesn't accommodate social and human sciences very well. In fact, they have a little paragraph, which I can't show here again, but it's actually in the PowerPoint. There's a small paragraph where they explain how you could still fit social sciences into the falsifiability test, which is very odd. So they have a hard time accommodating that definition with social and human sciences, but I think bottom down, they want them to be in, of course, and be included. Things get even worse when they get to indigenous knowledge, as I showed in the presentation, because there, nothing, they say, actually fits the definition, and that's really tragic. And as I explained in my lecture, they end up circumventing the problem by saying, oh, well, but it comes through the self-determination rights of the group, or it comes through cultural rights. You know, it gets really muggy, and it's very regrettable for all the reasons I gave before. So that's what I can say on the UN side. But your question is particularly important from a second perspective, which is, should international human rights law attempt at defining science? And the answer is no. We don't actually provide a definition of democracy, a definition of health, a definition of culture, because there is a human right to participate in democracy, a human right to participate in culture, or a human right to health. What we do is we collect state practice, consolidate it, and gradually develop the content of the right on the basis of that emerging consensus and practice of states. So it's not up to human rights bodies to define science. It's not about scholars either. It's about our political communities, our epistemic communities, gradually to come up with a conception of science that this may be more encompassing, more diverse than the one we'd had so far. And then a third comment, but this is not something you raised orally, but you raised it in written. I'm entirely on your page in terms of Kuhn versus Popper. So I think we agree on this. So now getting to your second question, which is also particularly interesting, on the rapports between the right to participate in a democracy and the right to participate in science. So I think the first thing to say is that conceptually they're related. This is why I raised the right to science, because conceptually you have two rights that are participatory rights and which are misnamed when we name them as a right to. So this is why I raised the comparison, because it's interesting. Now, what's also interesting, and that's my second answer to you, is that it goes beyond the conceptual comparison. There's actually a normative comparison here to make. There's a normative connection between the two. And I'm very Mertonian on this, or very much, you know, in line with people like Heather Douglas, as I said before, or Philip Kitcher. And I think the human right to science actually confirms this democratic dimension of participation in science. It actually guarantees it and protects it. But as I said before, and that's my third point, it doesn't have to be symmetrical. The kind of democratic participation in science that we refer to and that I referred to in my talk does not have to mimic political life or democracy in a political life. And the interesting is to find points of connections, as I said before, but also ways of organizing science democratically that do not mimic public democracy, just as we have social democracy in trade unions and so on. So that's what I can say, I think, to your comments. I think it covers your question. As to your third question, it's also a very tricky one. This is it echoes, of course, the dual use question. So my answer would be first that I don't think there's much prospect in distinguishing between science and applications, or between pure science and applied science. I think they're always connected in so many ways. But that's my position, and I've argued for this elsewhere. But to the extent that they're always mixed, I don't think it makes much sense arguing that science can never be dangerous, but only applications of science can be dangerous. I think this is a very widespread view, and it's very reassuring for scientists, but it's not the way it goes. When you do research, you actually know, and you even think of applications in so many ways, in biology, in genetics, in AI. So I don't think this is the right way to escape the quandary and reply to you, because that would be the easy way out, is to say, look, there's pure science, and then there's the applications, and the military is just an application. I think it's not as easy as that. And as we know today, the two sectors are extremely connected, and a lot of research is actually conducted within the context of military research. So to that extent, I think both, or at least, science that is conducted in the military context would obviously qualify as science as well. But this doesn't mean that all science goes. And this is where the human right to science actually becomes very interesting. Because as I've argued elsewhere, but also tonight in the lecture, I think it was conceived straight away, and we can see this confirmed in the various UN interpretations that I have showed in the PowerPoint. We can see that it was conceived straight away as a dualist right, as protecting science as something that is valuable, that is a good for all human beings, but also something that we need to protect human beings against. And that was there, hand in hand, from the very beginning. And that makes the human right to science a very powerful way of approaching the current high risk, high uncertainty kind of science we're doing today. I think it's a wonderful resource to anticipate both the risks and the benefits of science. And I've organized a workshop on this in December, and the publication is forthcoming. So if you're interested, there will be publications on this. So it's very interesting because it takes the anticipation and the assessments of risks away from the hands of scientists, because we usually defer to them. We have a scientific understanding of precaution, of the precautionary principle. But the human right to science tells us no. Of course not. You can't use the precautionary principle and interpret it in a scientific way when you're actually assessing how best to protect the human right to science. That would be, that would undermine the whole purpose of the human right to science that is there to protect our fundamental equality against the misuses of science. So that's what I can say in response to your comment. I don't know. I'm sure you have a follow-up on this.
As to the last point, so yes, what you say is that anyway, all these scientific and technological activities are included in today's discussion, so not treated as separately, and they should be treated with the same framework of international law, but probably with some, how to say it, probably it can be treated case by case, of course, according to the context.
It should be treated case by case, because human rights duties are always specific to context. So the right is abstract. This is why we can talk about the right tonight. We only know what the duties are specifically in a given context. They change from state to state, from context to context, from science to science, from scientist to scientist. And this is why it's so wonderful. So of course it will be context-based. But to reply to the first element of your follow-up question, I think science and its applications are to be included in the human right to science, and the military as well as the other. Yes. And in fact, most of the examples I gave in my introduction today have a military dimension.
Oh, you mean
AI?
yeah, of course,
spatial. science for sure.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Genomic editing and genetic engineering in general, and geoengineering clearly. So we've clearly moved towards this kind of meshed science and technology. And I know this is a big topic at Tokyo College, so I just wish there were some of those people in the room.
Yes, there are in fact several questions coming, so for you can
And do you want me to reply to your last point or not? The one on implementation?
Question 4, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, you want me to?
Go ahead, please.
So
yeah,
of course, sorry.
Yeah, I should ask a question because I didn't talk about it in public. So my first question was, in fact, it is about the obstacles to the implementation of human rights to science in the contemporary global context. So what are the obstacles? This is just really general question.
That question is related to the question from the audience, which is a lot of political pressure on research activities, especially with regard to cutting-edge scientific result. One of the audience asked you that is it possible to sustainably operate an institution that protects researchers and their rights to research results across borders?
Yeah, thank you very much, both to the person in the audience and to you, Sayaka, on this. This is key. Of course, if you ask a lawyer what to do to implement the law, you're probably asking the wrong person. Because what we do is define and specify the obligations of state, as I said today. So my purpose has been to kind of interpret the rights, specify its content, its duty bearer and the right holder, to show that there's huge potential that's not been used and that we could use in invoking and in holding our states accountable and making sure they actually comply with the right. Okay, so all this needs to be done, but I'm sure there's potential. It starts with us. It starts with us in states, so it starts with domestic courts, obviously. It starts with NGOs. And once you get the ball rolling at the UN, things can move actually quite quickly through the UN system, the Committee on Economic Social Rights, but also special rapporteurs, even universal periodic review. But bottom down, I think it has to start with us in the public, with us scientists, and with us in our scientific association and organization. So Professor Oki, I know you're a member of the International Scientific Council. This is a very important organization, but we can do much more institutionally and internationally to protect science. We've lived with more or less the same organizations for a long time now, and I think there's much more we can do among ourselves. There's also much more we can do at UNESCO. We know science came late in UNESCO's title, but we're very pleased it is there now. But we can do much more. The organization can really be reformed, revised, revivified in the instruments it develops. It can be used to make states more accountable than it has so far. So, I think there is scope to do more once we actually know and understand and can put what the right actually means out there. And that was the purpose of the lecture today, is to make sure we understand what we mean when we say it has to be participatory, when we say that science has to be public, when we say it has to be institutionalized, when we say it has to be democratic. And this, of course, has ripple effect for funding. That is the questions that's been raised. Absolutely, this is key. We need to require proper public independent funding, and we need to find a way to protect ourselves against
independent funding
pressure. Yeah.
Not from the state, you mean, or not from the private foundation?
Well, so it all depends on the state. So that's the problem of context I was mentioning before. So obviously, I don't know exactly the context in which the question was raised, but of course, if we're talking about states that are using the public funding to steer research in a certain direction, then that's problematic too. So usually the answer is to find forms of mixed fundings, where the private funding is sufficiently independent not to earmark the research. So, we've not found the ideal way of dealing with this, but we kind of experience different ways. Private foundations that will get some public funding, but which will have a free hand in allocating it, for instance, like the Swiss National Science Foundation. So they are different ways of organizing this, but absolutely, this is at the core of the consideration, and there is discussion of this in the general comment 25. So that's what I can say so far.
Any other things to feedback, Professor Oki?
Oh, yeah, if I have time, okay. But I'm really agree with you, and I think, for example, I wonder if today's topic can be something comes to the next of sustainable development goals, something like these SDGs. In fact, in Japan, unfortunately, international context is rather invisible to many of the citizens. But strangely, the sustainable development goals fixed in 2015 was really advertised everywhere, and everyone knows it. Well, it is just an example, but I know very well that the international society can fix the goal, and many people can follow it. So I have really, listening to your lecture, it gave me really a hope for a future society about our capacity to fix a goal and our capacity to move on, especially in the problem of difficulties as today. So it is just my comment from my heart.
So, thank you so much. So if I can react to this, because I think this is really getting really, really interesting. I would say three things. As I mentioned before, I think we can do much more in our scientific institutions. We need to take responsibility, this communal responsibility I was talking about before. And we need to avoid this kind of self-validating, self-defensive positions that scientists have had too often. We need to get out this position and be more constructive and more pragmatic about it. So that would be the first thing I would say. That would be a sea change. The second thing is, I didn't mention this sufficiently, but of course, you mentioned Japan, I mentioned Germany. I think there's a lot to gain from comparative constitutional law if we want to push this human right to science forward. If we need to flesh out its content, then it has to come bottom up from domestic democratic practices of sciences. And there is certainly a treasure of practice to find out there. And it starts with my visit and our encounter today, and I think there's much more to do in terms of comparison. And my final point on what you said on SDGs, it's interesting you say this, because I have many colleagues in the area of the human right to science who think this is the way forward. I know it's being pushed forward also in the context of the Committee on Economic and Social Rights. I tend to be extremely skeptical of the SDGs. Because they frame everything in terms of development and in an economic understanding of public goods, which is precisely the one I've been trying to steer away from. And they've done more harm than good to human rights. Because if you read the SDGs, they're goals, they're not duties. So normatively, they just take the normative edge of everything we've acquired and worked for so hard for 70 years in international human rights law. So I agree with you. SDGs are everywhere in our governments. Switzerland's the same. They reinvent the wheel and they actually weaken the acquis of international human rights law. So I'd be very skeptical about the benefits of taking the SDG route, except for publicity work maybe. And in fact, a footnote to my comment is that if you look at the SDGs and science in the SDGs, it's all about innovation.
Yeah.
And it's
That's
all
the problem.
Exactly. And it's very instrumental. understanding of science that they promote and push forward for development. So that's exactly the kind of science I've been arguing against in my talk tonight. So
I see. Well, we can fix the problem of SDGs and then go to the next era.
if only, yeah.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your very lively exchange of opinions, views, and perspectives. Human rights to science, that is a very important concept, and we need to keep discussing about this. And this is the starting point of discussion today here at Tokyo College, thanks to Professor BESSON. So let's continue the discussion. And for the audience, thank you very much for your attendance, and see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yep.